Great to see you.
Yeah, good to see you as well.
Thanks for doing this. I'm totally thrilled and honored to be asked to interview you because I'm so excited about your leadership and where you're headed. So I thought what we would do for the sake of the viewing audience, give you a little outline that I think you've seen. That we'll start a little bit about your journey before JA quickly, and then talk about your career to date, and talk about how what you thought you really enjoyed and accomplished at JA International. Talk about 3DE, and then kind of wrap it up with a little bit maybe about how you see the future, if that's okay. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
sounds great. Yeah, sounds
Okay.
great.
All right. Well, I we have a kind of an interesting spirit here. I think your roots go back to Connecticut, where I'm sitting right now,
Mhm.
where I have
Mhm.
been since 1986. So I'll just turn it over to you. Give us a little bit about your life journey up until the time you connected into JA.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So actually, it's funny because when you just said 1986, that's actually the year that I moved to Connecticut also. Um,
Oh,
but as a kid with my family, we had come from the Chicago area, and but spent most of my at least middle school, high school years living in Connecticut. I'm the oldest of six kids, so the whole family had grown up there. Um, the way that I had gotten to, so what's interesting, because I was actually thinking about that question, like what was my career journey before JA? And as I get more long in the tooth with JA, my career journey before JA is actually very, very short. but but it is but it is relevant, I think, in some ways in terms of how I got here. There was right after college. I had taught for a couple of years. It wasn't necessarily something I was looking at as a career, but it was something that I had been interested in. And so I was teaching middle school history and then coaching high school football and baseball. But I knew I was only going to do that for a couple of years. I didn't have an education degree or anything of that nature. So it was just a short stint. And but I'd always had this interest in education, and a lot of that came from my dad as well, who had just really instilled in all of us just the value of education and what that can mean in terms of opening up opportunities. But a lot of what I had studied in college was more around international political economy and economic development, and so I'd gone from working teaching for a couple of years, and then went and worked with at Smith Barney for a couple of years in business. Didn't love it, honestly, but it was a good just exposure to a completely different sphere of career and work than what I'd been seeing in education. And so what was interesting about JA was not on my radar at all. I'd kind of stumbled into it. It was right when the international headquarters had moved to Atlanta, and we can get into a little bit more of that. But what had intrigued me from it from the beginning was just this intersection between education and business. And it, in many ways, it had captured these two stints that I had done in work in other areas in a way that was able to package what I was passionate about all in one place.
well, that's terrific. I think that our life journey lines, which I've done some breakout groups about, are really important and powerful. And it's interesting because I kind of stumbled into junior achievement. I was in there JA 34 years, but I stumbled into it not really knowing what it was, but it
Mm-hmm.
was the intersection of business that I grew up in back home and
Mm-hmm.
education and kids,
Mm-hmm.
and those were passions. And I was fortunate to early on in my career get connected to something that I was passionate about. I think people
Mm-hmm.
struggle a long time to find that. So we both kind of had parallel paths in that regard. Um, your Tell us a little bit about your career at JA, and and take us up to your time at JA International.
Mm-hmm.
Was that
So,
the start?
yeah, that was the start. And
Okay.
so it was early 2002. So I've been working at Smith Barney for about 2 years at that point in time, and knew that that was not a career path that I wanted to really pursue much further. And so I'd actually applied to grad school. I was going to Georgia Tech for a master's in international affairs. And as I was talking with people about just what I was interested in, getting kind of back to the roots of international economic development, political economy, somebody had said to me, "Hey, there's this organization that just moved their international headquarters to Atlanta. It's called Junior Achievement. Sounds a lot like the kind of work that you would want to get into. You should look them up." And that was literally right at the time. I think J International had been in Atlanta for maybe a month at that period of time, and real small team, but they had gone through some transitions. And so I had reached out to the CEO at that time, someone you knew well, Paul Ostergaard,
Yeah.
and just introduced myself. So this is what I was looking to do, and he invited me to come in for an interview. I remember that it was like a 6:30 or 7 o'clock in the morning interview. Which, if you know Paul, that makes sense. If you don't know Paul, you're like, that doesn't make any sense at all.
Dan.
But I remember coming to the building on Abernathy Road, because JA International had subleased some space from JA of Georgia, and Donna Buchanan was the president of JA of Georgia at the time. I remember coming to the building, and of course it was empty because it was 6:30 in the morning, and for this interview, and we just were having this casual conversation. And Paul, at the end of the interview, he said, "Well, we don't really have any positions right now, but what are you looking to make?" And in retrospect, I think I completely lowballed myself, because whatever number I said, he immediately said, "Actually, that could work for us." and so he's like, if you can start in a couple of weeks, just come and we'll figure out what job makes sense for you when you're here. So it really was just this really interesting set of circumstances that was just very opportunistic. And I was ready to dive in. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. I did not have any background knowledge of JA at that time, but the work really interested me. And what was cool about that time is JA International in a lot of ways felt like its own startup. And so this idea of kind of figuring out where the niche was, where the need was, and where the work could be was very true. It wasn't like there was a job description that you just had to follow that. It was really about saying, where's the need? Where can we create value? And so over a 3-year period of time, I worked with JA International. That was also during the time when JA Inc. and JA International merged. That was a whole other kind of parallel story of what was happening during that time. But in terms of the JA career aspect of it, I had the opportunity to be in 30 different countries over that 3-year time span. I always say I was like very underqualified for any of the work that I was doing, but I was the only one doing it. So it's like, you just sort of grab onto the opportunity.
Not to interrupt, but just it's really interesting what you just described, because one of the leaders I studied and spent time with, Jim Collins, good to great, all that kind of stuff. And his one of his mantras is get the right people on the bus first and figure out what you want to do. And that sounds like you were a model of that, quite
Yeah,
frankly.
and I don't know if it was an intentional model, but it worked out. But I just fell in love with the mission so fast, and just being able to see the work that Jay was doing around the country. It really hit a passion point for me in terms of really thinking through like innovative solutions to deep systemic challenges, and really seeing how JA's work was positioned in some really meaningful ways in these countries. But I also knew that the real work was happening on the ground in these countries, and so that's kind of part of what had led me to look to then moving and working inside JA of Georgia.
Yeah. Well, what would you say you might consider one of your top 1 or 2 accomplishments during your time with JA International?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I don't know if I was experienced enough to really accomplish anything at that time. I learned a ton, and the experience was fascinating. And it's a lot that I still harken back to. I'd say the one thing though with that question was maybe just the work in bringing the network together. When I joined J International at that time, it was about 100 different member nations, and it was very disparate. Like there wasn't really a community among those countries. It wasn't necessarily an aligned or shared goals, objectives, values. And that was a lot of the work that we were doing over that 3-year period of time. And I think in many respects that was successful. The part that I learned the most from was being a part of the merger negotiations between JA Inc. and JA International. And that was learn for the good and learn for the bad, in terms of just like all the different, kind of power dynamics that were happening at that point in time. But it was to be in my mid to late 20s involved in those conversations was a really good learning opportunity.
That's great too. I remember when I was working for Ron Cody in the Twin Cities in my 20s, JA Minneapolis and St. Paul merged, which is like, there's a Mississippi River divides the two, but it might as well be a big wall.
Right.
So it was the first time any nonprofit had merged, and the learning that took place there was incredible.
Yeah.
So it's much smaller scale than yours. I understand completely what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Uh, and then take us from your time at J International to the next step in your journey.
So was at J International for 3 years. So this takes us to 2005. And a couple of things were happening at that time. On a personal level, we had just had our first child, and so at the travel schedule I had at that point, I was out of the country a good portion of the year, and so just didn't think that was going to work with young kids. But more relevant to the JA piece is harkening back to what I mentioned in terms of like, I knew that the real work was happening on the ground. Like I might be like popping in and out of countries for a couple of days, a week here and there, but really the sustained work of transformation on the ground was happening by those local teams, local leadership, local boards. And I was interested in kind of getting at the ground level of really seeing like how can we position JA's assets to really move the needle on some systemic change issues. And so that opened up an opportunity because we were subleasing space from JA of Georgia, had gotten to know Donna Buchanan pretty well during that period of time. And as we just started having some conversations, she had mentioned that there might be an opportunity if I was to come over to JA of Georgia in a like head of development role, and then kind of see what happens, right, from like a succession planning perspective. And so that's how I made the move to JA of Georgia. And Donna and I worked together for, I think it was about 3 years, 2 or 3 years. First, I was head of development, the chief operating officer, and then she had retired from JA. And so it was in 2008 that I became president for JA of Georgia, and then was there total of 10 years through that process.
Well, that's great. I mean, I want to have you talk a little bit about connecting to 3D and all that. But the other thing is just, in the leadership studies, you talk about inside outsiders and outside insiders.
Mm-hmm.
It makes you a perfect inside outsider.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you come and now you're pushing some great new ideas and all that. So, did you got connected with 3DE while you were in the Atlanta office?
Well, yeah, I'll give the quick 3DE Genesis story. So with J of Georgia, the time that I was president there, I kind of block into 3 different segments. Became president July 1st, 2008. It was that fall that the market crashed. And so the kind of the first stint of JA of Georgia was working through that financial crisis. But then using that crisis as an opportunity to begin to scale up a lot of the good work that the organization had already been doing, but just to get a higher level of trust and credibility with our school district partners. So kind of first stint was scaling up some of the work that had been there during that period of time. Starting around 2011, it's about 3 years in, we started really looking at, in a deep way, bringing J BizTown, J Finance Park to Atlanta. And so we had a few corporate partners and individual philanthropists that had demonstrated an interest in it. And that was a pretty big project for us because we were not only going to build the facility in downtown Atlanta, but part of what our board had decided early on is that we were only going to do it if the school districts felt like there was enough value in it to actually mandate it and embed it as a part of core curriculum. So we knew we had to get all of the school districts in the Metro Atlanta area to see the value in it, mandate it for all their 6th graders, all their 8th graders, so that we could really go out to the community and say, this is going to be a new part of the education landscape for middle school students in the area, and really like feeding on the whole idea of relevance of education and all of those pieces. I mention that because that was then really the jumping off point for how 3DE got started. You've probably heard this, but just for anybody that's watching this might not have heard it. One of the school districts that we were working with on that Discovery Center project was Fulton County Schools, and there was a superintendent there who's very progressive, very innovative, highly regarded. And it was literally the week of the grand opening of our Discovery Center with BizTown Finance Park. And he called and said, I've been thinking about this, like, you're going to have all of our middle school students from Fulton County coming through this center, and they're going to see learning that's engaging, it's relevant, it's experiential, it's team-based, it's project-based, it's interdisciplinary. He's like, it's every it captures every buzzword in education right now. And then they're going to go to a high school environment that still feels like what it was 50 years ago, where subjects are taught in silos. They're not applied to anything in the real world. There's nothing about it that's project based in any sort of sustainable way. And he said, so I would just be curious, based off of what you guys know from a JA perspective and who you're connected to with the broader business community, what would you do if you could have a blank slate to redesign high school education from the ground up? And he's like, and if you had an idea, I'd be willing to give you a charter, and you could create this JA charter high school, and then that could be like your innovation incubator for the future. So that was, mind you, that was like 2 days before our grand opening. But this is, to this day, is the coolest phone call I've ever received, ever. Right? Like, where you get an invitation from a superintendent of a large urban school district that says, "What if you had a blank slate?" And so, thought about it. You talk to a couple people. Next day I call him back and I was like, all right, the blank slate idea, like that we could lean into that. But us doing it as doing a charter school, that just doesn't feel right, because it might be great for that group of students, but it's not very scalable. It's not very replicable. And if we were going to do something, we'd really want to do something that could have meaningful impact in terms of being able to scale up and be replicable. And so, to his credit, he said, all right, I believe enough in what you guys bring to the table that I'd be willing to outsource to you whatever you're willing to take. I'll keep whatever you don't want. If that means we're creating a whole new model in education, then let's go for it. And that was the start of how 3DE became a thing. Of course, it was 2 years of design process from that phone call to what it was, but that's where it stemmed from.
But those are obviously defining moments, right?
Yeah.
And I love what it's all about, because I remember back to when I was working in New York City, one of the New York City schools chancellors, their lofty title, but it's superintendent, said that he was convinced that the reason kids weren't learning in New York City was because they didn't know why they needed to.
Yeah, exactly.
This is exactly what it addresses. So it's beautiful. And then we were within a month of signing an agreement with him to be lead partner, and then in their infinite wisdom, they replaced him. So we never got to the the launch point, but never launched. So I'm so excited for that, what you just described, and what can be happening all over the country with 3D and all that kind of stuff. Because from hearing what the description was in the meeting in Kansas City, it's just really making a difference.
Mm-hmm.
Again, Peter Drucker said the only reason for a social sector organization to exist is to make a difference and change lives. And I think you're bringing JA to a place where it really can do that.
Mm-hmm.
That's terrific. So I know that they want to make your conversations kind of two-part, take it more deeply into 3DE and all that in the next interview. But I do have an interesting question, and I suspect you've been thinking about this, and that is, if the results are as good as they seem, and I'm sure they are, and they're continuing to be good. If somebody in their infinite wisdom in the federal government says we'd like this in every school, how would you respond?
Yeah. So there are if funding gets taken off the table, which I think there's two things that we have to think about. One that's external, one that's internal. The internal one is just our own capabilities as an organization to deliver on something like 3DE that really is it's a joint venture with school districts. It's a very different go-to-market strategy, the capabilities, that talent that's needed to deliver on it, the kind of the mindset around it. And that's, I think, one of the opportunities that we have in front of us, like as an organization, like how do we lean into that type of work, and how do we begin to think from a JA perspective of how do we, build our own talent internally? How do we really position ourselves? What kind of learning do we need to be that type of an organization? And I think we can do that. Externally, I think what's interesting is probably the biggest barrier is political willpower. And what you often see, and it's interesting what you just said about the chancellor, like what you often see in education, everyone actually knows exactly what the problems are. Like this has been studied to death. Like no one needs to do any sort of like analysis of like, what are we trying to solve for? Everyone knows like learning needs to be more relevant, needs to be more experiential, needs to be more connected to the real world and to careers, needs to be more project-based. Like everyone knows what works in education. The problem is that there's so many structures and systems and processes that are baked into the education system that are really challenging to change, like with any system itself. And rather than having the political willpower to do the hard work to change some of those structures and processes, oftentimes people just opt for the easy bolt-on, right? Like let's address the symptom versus addressing the root issue. And it does require visionary leaders, visionary superintendents, and others that say, all right, we're willing to take a risk on addressing some of the root issues, even though we know the work might be more complex, might be more complicated, might be longer term. And I think JA is a trusted partner to so many school districts. I think school districts are willing to take a risk on JA in a way that they aren't as willing with other organizations. And so that's inherently where our opportunity is, but we need more of those types of visionary superintendents that are willing to step out of the box and try something new, try something different. And you made the point earlier that right now the average length of a urban superintendent is less than 3 years, right? So there's this constant churn in education, and that constant churn leads to a lot of cynicism and skepticism as to whether or not real change is possible. So that's the beacon of hope that we're trying to take out to the communities, is like, actually we have a model that can be reason to believe that this is possible, as long as we get the right multi-sector collaboration to have it come together to work.
And if you can get, I suspect if you can get it embedded so deeply that it can be sustainable throughout leadership transitions.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So once it's in, and it's really sticky, right? Like it's really sustainable. Yeah. The harder part is the front end, and maybe like the first couple of years, like you're going through the change and it's bumpy. Like are people staying focused on what needs to happen to get it through that change curve? And then once it's there, I mean, it really is highly sustainable.
Yeah, no, that's great. I have high hopes, and I'm confident that you'll be able to do some of that. And I don't mean to be leapfrogging into the next interview that you'll have about 3D and all that, but if you were to, if you saw an article in the New York Times or any other publication that of note that articulates in 5 years from now what you've accomplished, are there a few bullet points that you can think of that say, if in 5 years we look back and say, here's what we've done to embed this to really help kids, what might that sound like?
Yeah, so part of the position that we've been talking about as a network is all under this banner of accelerating economic opportunity and mobility for youth. And that everything JA is doing and can and should be doing is really moving at least one of the building blocks of how we accelerate economic opportunity. One of the other things that we've been talking about is that there's two viable approaches to that type of work. You can have a youth development approach that's very individual, student by student focus in terms of the skill sets, mindsets, behaviors that they need to succeed and thrive in a rapidly changing economy. And JA, like that's our bread and butter, right? Like we're really, really strong in the youth development area, and we've got strong capabilities there. And then there's the other, another way of approaching it, which is through a systems change approach, which is how do we not just address the symptoms, but how are we actually working in partnership with the education system and the industry and employer community to address the root issues that are creating this never-ending kind of cycle of underperformance. And that's where I think JA has the greatest opportunity. I think we are very uniquely positioned as an organization to continue to build off the strength of our capabilities in youth development and begin to position them towards working in this more strategic, systemic type of way with school district partners. And it can't happen overnight. It's long work, but that in 5 years from now, it would be awesome if we are being recognized as an organization that has made that positioning successfully, right? Where there's proof points in communities across the country, maybe in some unexpected places that people are like, yeah, JA is really moving the needle on some systems change work. I don't know if we'll get all the way there in 5 years, but I think we'll get a good bit of the way there.
Oh, I think that's a terrific way to define it. I mean, if you're right, you're going to see that article. I mean, that's really net what is going to have to happen for you to be where you want to be. And I think that's terrific. as you know, I spent a lot of time in 34 years JA, passionate about leadership. I spent time at the Drucker Foundation, spent time at the Lean Startup Organization, and had an opportunity to watch a lot of great leaders. And one of the reasons I'm very excited about your leadership in it for JA of USA right now is because when we were at the Drucker Foundation, we talked about leadership in 2 dimensions. We talked about how to be and how to do. And how to do is a technical capability to do the job. The how to be is more, how you treat people. And some people would call it the soft skills, but it's not really. It's much more than that. But I think you're a really great embodiment of both. So JA is very, very fortunate to have you in that chair right now and to lead the place, and very excited to watch and be happy to do anything I can to be supportive of whatever you're doing at any place. So I wish nothing but great luck. I look forward to seeing you this summer. I don't know how long they expected this to be, but I think we've covered a lot of territory in a succinct amount of time. So I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, no, thanks, Doug. I appreciate that. It's a really good time. Only other thing I would say is that as we're going through this, strategic positioning, what's been really heartening to see is how much across the JA areas, JUSA team, the senior leadership team, just how much people are really embracing and leaning into this type of work. And as you know, like there's great talent across the organization and great minds, and so being able to bring all that together in a way that really can envision where we're moving as an organization has been invigorating. It really has.
It's terrific. And I would leave you with one last Druckerism. And it's not the job of leadership to create energy, it's to release energy. And I see that happening. I see it, you continue to do that. And that's what a leader's supposed to do. And I'm just very excited for Jay's future because you're there.
No, thank you, Doug. Appreciate it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.